todos.
Good morning to everyone.
Depois de painel super interessante,
After a very interesting panel, we have our next panel to talk about a very relevant topic. I've lived for the last 6 years on the African continent, and the energy or power issues are very important, not only there, but all around the world. But we need to have a broad debate and pragmatic debate on this, and not only stay in the discussion stage, but actually have actions. So I'd like to invite Mr. Enio Verri, who is the Brazilian General Director of Itaipu, Binacional, Professor Carlos Lopes, who will have a virtual participation. He's the Honorary Professor at Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, Faculty of Commerce, University of Cape Town. Mr. Paulo Gomes, who is the Chairman of the Advisory Board of the Africa Southeast Asia Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much. Also, I invite Mr. Hadaes from Piccoli, Sustainable Fuel General Manager at Petrobras, and Mr. Bharat Adlaka. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly.
Paulo Gomes, Carlos Lopes, acho que eu não esqueci de ninguém.
Okay, I don't think I forgot anyone. I think we've got everyone here on stage. Please go ahead and have a seat.
Salva de palmas, que esse é painel de peso.
So this is a very
os profissionais estavam aqui, eu falei, não tem nem roupa para participar
a panel of heavyweights. When I read this, I thought, I don't even have the appropriate clothing to be part of this panel. But we have a lot to discuss, so let's go ahead and get in. So the issue of energy transition. In the last 6 years that I've been covering the African continent, this has been a recurring topic. And the same way that we talk about energy transition, do you have translation or do you speak Portuguese?
No Portuguese.
No Portuguese.
Not yet. Yes.
Not yet. Okay.
Are you listening?
Do you have translation? Do you need the translation?
Eu achei que ele tivesse tradução.
So I think we need to have a headset.
Vamos continuar aqui. Como eu disse,
so let's go ahead and continue. When we talk about power transition, we need to remember that we're talking about the African continent when millions of people don't even have access to power. So this is something, I think we are trying to change the tire in the car while it's still running, you know. But sometimes we're in the rain and we just have to keep driving. Brazil has been considered the 10th country that has the best power structure. This is according to the World Economic Forum report. So out of these 120 countries that were analyzed, in the 15 worst ones, 7 were African: Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Tanzania, and the Congo.
We're not here to teach Africa anyway, but the idea is that we can exchange experience. Both areas, both sides of the Atlantic can learn in events like that. So I'd like to start with Enio Verri. Brazil stands out in terms of energy transition. We are well positioned in this area. We are a world reference. So what is the main hurdle when it comes to energy transition? Good morning to you all. I'd like to greet my colleagues that are part of our table. Allow me to talk about Itaipu plant first, power plant. That's the first in the world in terms of energy production, has produced 3 billion kilowatts hour since '84 when it started up to today, and it represents 10% of the energy consumed in Brazil and 75% of the energy consumed in Paraguay. It has a special characteristic. It's a binational company. Itaipu, 50% belongs to the Brazilian government and 50% belongs to the Paraguayan government. We have a common governance there. So this experience is a very rich one because it proves that integration, as we are talking here, is something possible in a big country as Brazil, associated to a smaller country as Paraguay, and we have a very good relation in building the company. About what we can exchange in terms of experiences, and this is the word, to exchange experiences. It means that we have a lot in common when it comes to geography, culture, and we can learn a lot with this exchange. Itaipu, in addition to being a hydroelectric company production, Brazil is a country that has the biggest percentage of hydroelectric production. Another sector that is growing a lot in Brazil is the sun and wind energy. 40% of the energy implemented in Brazil comes from wind and sun, which is clean and cheap energy, in addition to hydroelectric energy. Itaipu is the only one that has a reservoir. The other uses the flow of rivers, and now they are going through this drought that is the biggest in 70 years. Rivers are dry, the power plants are not working, but Itaipu is producing because of the reservoir. In terms of exchanging experiences, it's because of the geographic characteristics of the African countries and the Arab countries as well, and using sun energy and wind energy as well. This is very important because the cost is low for the production. The cost that consumers pay is very low. There's only one problem. It's not a energy that is a steadfast one. There's no wind, when there's no sun, there is no energy. Therefore, sun and wind power or energy, which is a great jump in terms of price, quality, and access to the population. If there is no alternative on a steadfast energy, it does not work. So that's what we can say is the role of hydroelectric power plants that fills the glass. So if you see the glass, part of the glass is produced by sun and wind energy. Even some parts of the country that uses fossil fuel to produce energy. And my colleague from Petrobras can talk about that. Roraima is still not integrated in the system. But this varies. Who fills in the glass is the steadfast energy, usually done by hydroelectric power plants. So this can be a great technological innovation, exchanging experiences that will contribute to our country. When it comes to Africa, when you talk about this half full, half empty glass, I think this is the most significant aspect because we have reasons to complain and criticize, but also we can say where we can go. And we hope that this glass will be full. By the way, Africa can have the biggest hydroelectric power plant in the world, the Republic of Congo. Paulo, how is the expectation, since we're talking about a continent such as South Africa, 80% of its energy comes from coal, so it's hard to see electric cars in the streets of Johannesburg while the source of energy is a dirty source. So, can we bet, can we be optimistic with regards to hydroelectric power plants, that it can be even bigger than the Chinese one, becoming the biggest hydroelectric power plant in the world? Well, I think that the energy in Africa will bring some tolerance to use a fossil fuel. At the same time, we are putting efforts towards renewable energy. Unfortunately, the debates we had for much time was to pressure Africa within a box to make only renewable energy, but I think we need a mix, reducing the amount of fossil fuel, coal,
heavy fuel,
because going straight to renewable energy requires a lot. The importance of having base load for our industrialization is not easy to make industries with renewable energy, but we are putting a lot of efforts in that. Countries such as Morocco is investing a lot in sun energy, and there's a huge potential there. Coming back to Inga has a potential between 40 and 70 gigawatt, which is the biggest in the world in Congo, but the cost would be really high. It's necessary almost $80 billion to do it, and that would be a set of 7 small dams in the Congo River. Unfortunately, when we had these discussions going on, there was a strong opposition with regards to the hydroelectric power plants. What Brazil did with Paraguay was just great. There was something against doing that. I went to the World Bank some years ago, and there was a pressure that the World Bank would finance hydroelectric power plants. Things are changing now. That's good news. We have a team that is working with the World Bank and Congo and other countries, because it's not only about building this dam, but the dam will have to produce Africa to South Africa, Angola. Transmission lines would be 2,500 kilometers to go from Congo to South Africa. This project has a problem in terms of ego, because what was done between Paraguay and Brazil, the two countries put the ego aside and decided to do something together. And I think this will require talking to our brothers in Congo, because at the end of the day, the place where the dam is at Congo. It belongs to Congo. So if they don't want to do that, we can do all the diplomatic work, but things will not move forward. So there must be some strategic approach with Congo. And the good news is that the international institutions such as the World Bank recognize that it's necessary to build this dam. So Inga Energy can provide energy almost to the whole continent. This cannot be only something done between Congo and multilateral institutions. It's necessary to bring countries from the south, such as Brazil, that are neutral in this process, to show the Itaipu experience. And it's necessary that there is no geopolitical guidelines. I think China will play a significant role in that, because in order to get equipment for the dam and the way we will buy it in a cheaper way would have the help of China and Brazil. So there's room for international cooperation for the dam, because producing renewable energy in Congo can also enable deforestation, because deforestation in Central Africa, with increase of population, especially Congo, that has almost 100 million people, and that's going to double. Other countries will double the population as well. So having renewable energy, otherwise population will cut trees, and that will create problems to whole humankind. So the build of this dam would be great, bringing some neutral player in the process of building this dam. And I think this will bring a positive impact not only to Congo, but to whole Central Africa. G20 can be a good opportunity for that, isn't it? Professor Carlos, can you hear me? Yes. Where are you now?
Cape Town. Eu
I'm
achei que
Cape
esse
Town.
evento ia ser a oportunidade que eu ia
I
conhecer o senhor
thought this
pessoalmente.
event
Já te
would
entrevistei
give me the
várias vezes.
opportunity
Quando
of
eu tô em
meeting
Cape
you
Town,
in
mando mensagem
person.
pro senhor nunca tá aí. Enfim,
Whenever I
a gente
send
se
you
encontra.
messages, I can never
Professor,
meet
sempre
you.
prazer falar
That
com o
will happen
senhor.
sometime. It's a pleasure
Quando
to
eu
talk
soube
to
desse painel,
you.
me lembrei logo do seu livro, né, Mudança
I
Estrutural em
remembered
África.
of your
E o
book,
senhor fala muito dessa
Structural
questão
Change
de
in Africa,
percepções
where you
equivocadas,
talk about
necessidades de novas
needs and
narrativas no
twisted
continente.
perceptions.
Enfim,
So, can we, considering what Paulo said, can we talk about a sustainable development model in a complex and dynamic continent such as Africa? Absolutely. I think it's important that people understand that Africa was for a long time a victim of a vision where the interpretation of the comparative advantages theory would always put Africa in terms of mineral resources. And this made that 80% of African exports are made of commodities. And this is somehow the continuity of a colonial model where there was a extractivist trend that continues in the economic structure. If you want to change this, it's necessary. Due to this exploitation of resources in Africa, we could develop the industry in other parts of the globe, and those parts of the globe have been developed and grew. They have a good quality of life, but they had two debts. One is a debt with regards to the planet, and we have had consequences in the climate that has not been created by the African people. And the second debt, they have done this creating high inequality levels. So we cannot correct one doubt without correcting the other. We cannot solve the climate problem without solving the problem of inequality. What is necessary to recognize is that Africa doesn't have access to the capital market. They are not, the economies have only 1% of global financing to 1.3 billion people. It's almost 100% of the current population of the planet, and soon Africa will represent 1/4 or 1/3 of the world population. So it's not possible to imagine that it will continue to develop with 1% of access to credit. In order to try to understand the consequences of this problem of liquidity, we have to understand that there are many promises done to repair in terms of climate matter. All the discussions about climate financing are only declarations, statements. The translation of that in practical terms means very little money coming to Africa. And the greatest reforms are usually only compensations that are marginal compared to the deficit we have. So if we have a continent that has 600 million people without access to electricity, we cannot solve this problem doing only mitigation, which is what renewable energy offer. We'll have to do, as Paulo said, a mix between mitigation and repair of our problem of access, which is very different from energy security. And the access issue requires us to use all means as possible, including fossil fuel. Of course, we don't want to prioritize fossil fuel, but African people easily say, what is the answer for all those who put pressure on them? The answer is little money on the side that is good. So if we have access to capital, to renewable energy, the potential of Africa is the biggest in the world. But if we don't have access to capital, to money, the money that comes to us for fossil fuel, is this what the African people will use? It's not in our hands to decide what are the priorities beyond our own will to be as clean as possible in our energy. Vinicius mentioned South Africa. South Africa is a country with a very dirty energy matrix because of coal, but this could be solved with access to capital that would enable us to invest in energy transition to renewable energy. But a program that we had by the government together with international partners mobilized $8.6 billion in promises that are not fulfilled yet, which is ridiculous in terms of what this program anticipated as needs, which is $73 billion. Just to give you an idea, 63 billion dollars. If they would be financed, it would be the biggest program in Africa, but that's ridiculous. $63 billion is what the U.S. will spend to repair, to make reparations of the two phenomena on extreme climate change results, which were the two hurricanes they had recently. So we have an asymmetry that is not recognized, and that puts Africa in a situation that seems that Africa doesn't want to do anything, or it seems that they don't know how to do things. But that's not the truth. It is because of this lack of access to capital. A country such as Ethiopia, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, has just finished building a dam that is the biggest one in Africa. And this dam had to be financed fully with money from Ethiopia because no international financial institution wanted to give money to Ethiopia. So this gives an idea of the size of our problem. The problem is not building Itaipu, is having access to capital that enable us to build an Itaipu.
Well, since you aren't here, if you would like to make some comment, please just, raise your hand or give me a sign that you want to comment. Now I'd like to turn the word over to Hades, who's Sustainable Fuel General Manager at Petrobras. We were talking, I don't know if you noticed, the difference in the size of Brazil and the African continent. It's almost like two puzzle pieces that could fit together, the Brazilian coast and the west part of the African continent. So my question is, what is Petrobras' presence in Africa? Are there some opportunities there? As Professor Carlos Lopes just said, is Petrobras able to participate in this energy transition, in this investment in the structure of the power and the energy transition on the African continent? Great question. Good morning. First of all, thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. It's an honor to be here with my fellow members here. And we were talking about this, about the similarities not only in the shape of the Brazilian country and the African continent, but also the fit of our East Coast and the African West Coast. So there are a lot of knowledge similarities, also different layers, to this, and this makes it easier for us to explore oil offshore, and so it's really no surprise that we have explored many of these opportunities on the African West Coast. So bringing together a bit of what each one has already said, Dr. Enio brought to light the issues of Itaipu, which is a huge symbol of success for our country. It's a binational project and which put Brazil ahead of many other countries in terms of our energy and our power matrix. So we're talking about the interactions between Brazil and Africa, but if you go to Europe and the US and Asia, we are able to be proud of the percentage of renewable energy that Brazil already uses to serve its population. And so, as also was mentioned by the colleague, put our egos aside to work on the challenges and be able to have this power matrix working. We also talked about Embrapa, which is also another source of pride for us, and we just recently signed a cooperation agreement with Embrapa in terms of developing these renewable fuels, because we do see these opportunities. Due to some internal issues, Petrobras took a few steps back, not also removed itself from Africa, but from other international locations. And after putting our house in order, we could say after a while, then we are looking to get back into these international places. Africa was the best example of internationalization. We had two different offshore fields, which were, without a doubt, what sustained our operations overseas. Not only the technical engineering issues, but the similarities between our countries. In this case, it was Nigeria. But business is done by people who have interests and strategies. So something that I also like to point out when we talk about Brazil and Africa, usually you talk about they are societies that are providing for the rest of the world. We've talked about billions of years and everything. I like to think long term, but not in billions of years. But let's say 75 years ago, 1950. And so let's think about 60 years ahead. All these projects that we are discussing here, they are very long-term projects. So when I make the decision to invest in an oil field, in solar energy, I'm going to be married to that project for years and years. So if we look at the African continent in 1950, it was less than 300 million people. We saw a photo here earlier about the population, 1.4 billion. And when we think to the future, 4.5 billion people. So there is a very evident movement of power energy, also food security, reduction of carbon emissions that are focused on the American, European society, and then focusing on the African, Asian, and Central and South Americas. So this is very relevant when we think about the movement, our next steps. And Petrobras then has gone back to its presence in Africa, and first of all in South Africa. So this is an example of how Petrobras sees this interaction with the African continent. We can offer what we already knew to do, exploring oil and gas offshore and on land also. We have different expertise in this area, and any fair discussion that is related to energy transition on a global scale, that involves Brazil and Africa. An example is Germany, which has a hydrogen program that's based and that uses renewable energies. So they get everybody who is willing to buy and sell hydrogen from renewable sources. And usually there's a gap. It's usually much more expensive than people are willing to pay. So what the government does is who is willing to pay more and who is willing to sell it for a cheaper price. And in Germany, 6 months ago was an Egyptian project, for example. So this is a real example of a country from the African continent who was able to compete you know, at the same level with huge companies with the technical skills. So this is a great advance. I understand that this type of initiative multiplied by technological cooperation can be very interesting for society in general. Thank you very much. Mr. Baharat Adlaka, did I pronounce your name correctly? Can you understand me? Okay. Well, now I'm going to speak in Portuguese, and you will be able to hear it in your language. Mr. Banat is director of the UTEM Sucrotec International. It's a company that focuses on the generation of ethanol and renewable energy. So you are the only non-Brazilian participant here. But what do you see as being the opportunities in the Brazilian market in the sugar industry and ethanol production?
As a producer of bioenergy projects worldwide, I'm hoping to take Brazilian technologies to Africa so that we can further strengthen and learn from the mistakes that Brazil has made and the expertise that Brazil has, and take it to Africa in these bioenergy projects, be it for ethanol or for biomass. Now, when we look at investments in the renewable energy space in Africa, a large percentage of it is going to be hydroelectric. There's going to be solar, wind, but then there is always going to be agricultural waste, which can be used to create bioenergy, which is a small percentage of the energy matrix, but at the same time, it helps with rural electrification, and it helps preserve foreign exchange for a lot of these countries, which can then be used towards other meaningful projects as well. So when I'm building these projects, the plan is to take the best of the Brazilian equipment and bring it to Africa so that we can utilize Indian, European, Brazilian designs to ensure that these African countries get world-class projects. For example, right now we're developing 200,000 hectares of land in Nigeria, and Brazil with BNES has already given a line of credit of $1.2 billion to develop these projects. So Brazil is already really helping Africa. Now, when we develop this project and we develop this farm, a large part of it goes towards food security, but then a certain part of it, the byproducts of that, be it ethanol or be it bioenergy, then goes towards rural electrification of that area, which then further develops those communities. And I think this is really important, and I'm very happy and proud of the initiative that Brazil is taking in changing the energy matrix in Africa.
Thank you very much. Eu vou voltar, nós temos, acredito que tempo para mais uma pergunta.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question for each of you, and to hear from each of you. Mr. Verri, you were part of the working group that we are going to have the G20 meeting in November, also the UN meeting that dealt with very relevant issues, and we touched on the issue of cooperation, the hydroelectric plant in Congo, dams in Ethiopia and Egypt. So how can Itaipu participate in this process, in this dialogue? Is it with financial investment, with technology? How can we connect these different players? Well, as has already been mentioned, Brazil's experience, my colleague Paulo already said. Usually water is an issue that causes war. The World Bank has invited Itaipu technicians to give talks in various countries around the world where water has generated conflict. And our experts have gone there to say that water can become a solution and not a reason for conflict. So we have already contributed in that sense with our knowledge. What we can do, we can't offer financial investment, but we can offer partnerships to share technologies. I'd just like to briefly give this example. There was a region close to Itaipu that had a large problem. We had the pork production there, and what the farmers would do, they would, after killing the pigs, they would throw the carcasses in the river. And our IBAMA, our environmental agency, started to fine these farmers because it was polluting the rivers. So at Itaipu, we developed a project of biogas, which we used the carcasses of the pigs to create the this biogas. So these families weren't no longer polluting the rivers. They were making some money. We also have the production in Africa. The production of biomass and biogas is significant. Now, this example is just a small one, but I agree with what Mr. Carlos and with what Paulo said also. And I discussed this at our in the forum last year. The potential that Africa has is huge. The problem is who is financing this development. This is the main challenge to be overcome. At the UN General Assembly, we noticed that the countries, let's say the poor countries, I don't know if that's the correct term, but they were analyzing the climate change situation and the need for the energy transition. And they have the same view as the rich countries, but the poor countries, they always say, but who's going to pay for this? The rich countries don't touch on the subject of who's going to pay for it. So we have a consensus in terms of the importance, the significance of doing this, but we aren't discussing and we don't have a consensus about who's going to pay. President Lula is now, Brazil has the presidents of the G20, and next year with the COP30 and this the G20 meeting is the appropriate, the perfect moment to discuss this. We, I studied economics, so we talk about, wealth, acquisition, all of this. So the day to discuss these matters has come. We can no longer separate into different boxes. Oh, wealth transfer, growth, climate change. It's all the same thing. They are all interconnected. So thinking about the development of Africa, we need to have a global fund. The world needs to understand that energy transition is very necessary. Petrobras, I know, is doing this. And oil is financing energy transition, and Petrobras is doing this with great competence. So today we can't compare the size that Petrobras has and the challenges in other countries. No. But we have coal production, other types of fuel productions, other types of energy. How can these other types of energy contribute to the transition? One mode can't finance all of it, obviously. But we have technologies of biogas. The first industrial plant for SAF is in Itaipu. It's the first plant that does this. So we are willing and open to exchange with different countries, our technologies, the experience that we've had through the Foreign Ministry, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of Mines and Energy. But once again, I want to underscore the importance that President Lula has given, especially as the president of the G20 group, to the financing of this climate crisis that we are facing, and also taking advantage of the BRICS meeting and the COP30 that will be held next year to discuss these issues. Well, Paulo, there is a decarbonization discussion happening globally. We have the UE that's trying to impose this with fines. Do you agree with these types of measures that are imposing, or do we have different things we could do in the global south? When I lived in Ethiopia, we had African solutions for African problems. So I'm going to include Brazil here in this package here of the Global South. Do you think it would be best to have measures such as the UE does, or are there other solutions that we could have? Well, if you look at the case of the fines being imposed, these extra fees or taxes that the European Union is imposing, for example, with cocoa, the UE decided that it was going to levy more taxes from to the African countries that were exporting cocoa. So these are the types of things that you can't admit. They aren't acceptable. Now, they decided then to put off this decision, but this unilateral behavior and sometimes even arrogant behavior isn't acceptable. The African countries, went to a lot of work to build the cocoa supply chain. In the past, children were used, and so many times the cultural aspects were ignored. The smaller cocoa producers, usually the average size of the cocoa farms are 2 or 3 hectares. So to understand that as slavery or using children, it shows a lack of knowledge about the culture of these countries. So when we talk about this global agenda, I think the main problem is a lack of action. Similar to Carlos, I worked in the international environment. All of the challenges, the problems are mapped out. The problem is the solutions, taking action. And so I think Brazil could be very useful. I believe in this internationalization of Brazilian companies to be able to create maybe partnering businesses with some African countries and businesses to reduce the operational risk of some business ventures. One of the examples is Ethiopia was able to totally change the risk associated with their airlines. I was involved with Ethiopian Airlines to create another airline in West Africa, and people were very skeptical about it. But Ethiopia Airlines came in, they agreed to contribute with 30% of the business. We looked for other shareholders, banks, and other such businesses, and now the business is the best or the most profitable airline in Africa, and the net income of Ethiopia Airlines was around $35 to $40 million. So I believe that we have to go into a new stage, have a vision of the internationalization of Brazilian companies, and have these partnerships to develop some of the sectors. Because the risk goes beyond what Carlos mentioned about the capital, but people forget that Africa doesn't have all the opportunities that other countries in the rest have, even in the Americas, in terms of building capital. We didn't use, slavery to, move our economy. The capital that we have is what we have built, that we have, and it's very unequal. There's a lot of inequality still. So I think that Brazil's position in the G20 group could be used to attack or address this issue of capital and investment. I don't know if the world will be willing to listen. When you think about countries like France, who is very concerned about paying off its debt. And so in this type of situation, people don't really pay attention to the more international issues. So I have to say that I'm skeptical about the richer countries, having a more proactive behaviors. We shouldn't be naive in terms of these issues, but in the south region of the globe, we can think about building businesses in partnership, like Itaipu, which is a binational company, and the Ethiopia Airlines example that I gave. I think in terms of food production also. I think we're at the initial stages until the international system finally listens to us. They are going to listen to us because of our geographical location. The U.S. is worried with the Africans that are coming through Latin America to go into Mexico and then into the U.S. And so this immigration issue. So our urbanization projects are going to be huge, and it's an opportunity for the world, but also a challenge. So I believe that using these three platforms, the G20, the COP30, and Carlos also has a huge very important role in the change of the narrative in terms of climate change. So trying to focus more on the execution, I was at the forum last year, and so I think what we can do now is trying to have a barometer to measure what happened since last year, what happened in terms of public policies, in terms of our cooperation between Brazil and Africa. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs talked about what happened with Embrapa, but didn't go forward, the agricultural minister. So we need to think about the operation, the execution, but mainly create companies like Itaipu Binacional, so have this partnership in these different segments and see how this will create a snowball effect in industry and in the sector. And I think that could be what we can do until the international community understands that Africa can be the solution for the transformation globally.
Professor Carlos Lopes, what is your opinion in terms of the main way that Brazil can take part in this energy development in the continent of Africa? We had the example of Petrobras, BTG Pactual Bank. Before the pandemic, they had a specific fund created for Africa with $1 billion, and it was retracted later. So there was a time where Brazilian investments were growing, and now we are in a retraction period that might be changed, and I hope it will be changed. It was suggested in terms of Petrobras, but Africans were during those 2 decades, they had the impression that the presence of Brazil in the transformation of the continent is one of business opportunities, which was the case of the construction companies, and not of creating the foundation for some presence in Africa. And at the end of the day, that's related to the problems in the world. When there are economic problems, such as the financial crisis in 28, 29, 28, 29, or COVID, or anything else, such as the volatility of currencies and international inflation, there is a movement that is on the negative side of it. So this IO movement has to be overcome so we can have a more resilient foundation in the cooperation between Brazil and Africa, because this cooperation has everything to work, and it's not by chance that the trade with India and Africa 20 years ago was similar to the one with Brazil, and now that's the second biggest one in the continent. So $100 billion not speaking about China, that is 210, $100 billion. Even from the commercial interest standpoint, Brazil, due to this engagement not being so resilient, they lose opportunities with those countries because they come and they install companies, infrastructure. There are more than 30,000 Chinese companies working in Africa. And you can count with the fingers of one hand the number of Brazilian companies established in Africa. So there's the need of doing what is necessary so that Brazilian companies can see Africa not only as an opportunity of short-term commercial connections, but bringing equity, capital to be installed and take advantage of the opportunities the country provides. Let me give an example, because I'm involved in this directly, which is the production of meat, beef, to export to Middle East countries that are very important for Brazilian slaughterhouses. And now Indian investors are interested in this market, and they will start to be installed in Africa to export beef from Africa, because there are some African countries where there is a huge capacity of processing beef, and it makes no sense to count only on the Brazilian slaughterhouses considering the costs, because part of the bovine African cattle is from arid zones, so they have the advantage of having this label, this green label, rather than having an artificial pasture. So I can mention a list of opportunities. In terms of energy, even more. Brazil made some attempts of introducing biofuel, but it went not too far because they didn't have capital to do that. It was just some technical assistance, ideas, but there are many ideas already. We need capital to take incentives directly to the production. My last topic, I know I'm running out of time, but the two panelists, they have something in common, Baha and Hadaes, talking about the aviation sector that has a significant aspect in terms of CO2. Can we explore the sustainable fuel? We have fuel. India is a big producer of it. It's more expensive for airlines to use biofuel. So how can we use sustainable fuel for aviation? We're close to lunchtime, so I'll try to be brief. I like a reference that Professor Roberto mentioned. He mentioned three vectors: science, entrepreneurship, and public policies. These are the three vectors you're using to apply in markets, and the aviation fuel is one of the possibilities that we are using. The technology is there. It's available. We already have a domain of that for almost 100 years from the chemical standpoint. The point is to position countries in an honest discussion. We mentioned the discussion with Europe and US, the migration flows, and we noticed that in practical terms. There was a discussion during 10 years in the relationship between Mercosur and Europe, and the first sign of French farmers protesting what we did just ruined. There will be a competitive advantage, so Brazil, South American, African continents can position this way, but we have to have honest, pragmatic discussions that evolve. What we've done in Petrobras is really to help global problems, but also for our own survival. We will only see the population in 2100 if you have a population there at that point. So this global, honest effort that nations have to do it. SAF is one of the examples. There's a public policy being developed in Brazil, and fuel of the future is one of them. Biomethane, biogas is a huge opportunity that Brazil and Africa can have together. India as well. So we just have to tie up all those opportunities based on those three vectors that will make us evolve, not only in Brazil, but in the world. But how can we increase the production of sustainable fuel for aviation, in your opinion?
I think the developed countries will have to take a lead in because the initial costs of production are higher than regular fuel, and going forward, as the unit economics become better for sustainable aviation fuel, then we can introduce this in a big way in the African economy, because we have to do it in a phased-wise rollout. What is the need of Africa today? Is it sustainable aviation fuel, or is it electrification for homes? So it is definitely a good idea, and that is the future. It's biogas, sustainable aviation fuel, green hydrogen, but we have to look at it from the lens of Africa, not of the lens of a developed country looking at Africa saying, this is what we're doing, so this is what you should do as well. So it is definitely the right way going forward in the future, but we have to first start addressing the needs of what the continent of Africa needs. So from what the professor mentioned, financing is an extremely important aspect, and this is an area where India, Brazil, and a lot of countries can come together to further push the goals of the African Union for sustainable energy targets and the current installed capacity and the capacity that's coming in every year. We'll need 3 times more the investment on a year-on-year basis in order to meet those goals. So I'm hoping to take the chance in this forum to further reiterate that we need more money coming into Africa to develop these projects.
And that's a great opportunity for that. Okay, thank you all for this. Thank you all for this. I think everybody's hungry, right? That's a sign that lunch is being served. So, Professor Carlos, thank you very much. We'll meet somewhere in the world someday. Dear colleagues, thank you very much. Thank you all. Carol, floor is yours. Thank you all. So a round of applause to the panelists. That was so enriching. Thank you all for coming. Vinicius, thank you for the moderation. Professor Carlos, thank you for your time to be with us virtually.